So thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm very happy to introduce someone who really doesn't need any introduction, but I'll introduce her anyway. Beth Wilson, who's a longtime KUUF member. She's a retired public health manager and volunteer with Results. And she's going to be hosting this talk today on a book called The First Political Order: How Sex Shapes Governance and National Security Worldwide. So excited to turn it over to you, Beth, and hear what you have to say. Thank you.
Author. And this particular video is the one that we all think is the best. And she's addressing the Mudd Center for Ethics, which is named after Roger Mudd, the journalist. And it's at the Mudd Center for Ethics is at the Washington and Lee University, which is a small, fairly, the word elite isn't the right one, but very prestigious university on the East Coast, small. And they have speakers that come into the Mudd Center. So that's what you're going to see in just a second here. I have advanced the video that I'm going to show you past all the introductions and thank yous and setting up the PowerPoint, and I'm just starting it at the very beginning of her talk. And I found that if we go through the end of her talk and stop before we go into the questions and answers, it's about 47 minutes. And so that's what I thought I would play for you, is those 47 minutes. And I would, there's one point at which she introduces a word that's not familiar, none of us knew. And I'm going to stop it there, since some people may not be able to stay till the end. And I'll explain that word, and then I'll also see if there are any questions or comments that you want to make before we continue the video. And the word is rentourism. So when you hear a word that sounds like that, I'll be stopping the video so that I can explain that word to you. And it's fairly far into the talk that she gives. Yes.
It certainly is no new type of thought to suggest that the first political order in any society is actually the sexual political order that is established between males and females in the society. Sometimes to introduce that thought, I actually tell my students, why don't we pretend that we're in a video game design class and not an international affairs class. And so I want you to design a video game for me. And the only parameters I'm going to give you is that by and large, there are two roughly equal sized groups of players, neither of which, all right, can go on to the next round without the other. That is to say, unless those two groups cooperate, the game is over. There is no next round. And I say, build me a game. And they say, Professor Hudson, we don't have enough information to build a game. You have to tell us a little bit about these groups. Do they stand before each other as equals, or is one group kind of a superior group and one group kind of a subordinate group? How are decisions made for the group? Are they made by one of these groups or by both? And if they disagree, how are those conflicts resolved? Are they resolved peacefully? Are they resolved by force, domination, and coercion? And then, of course, the ultimate political question, how are resources, valuable resources, distributed equally between the two groups, or are they, can one group have greater claim on resources or even extort resources from the other group? And I say, bingo, you've just hit the nail on the head. These are deeply political questions. So the sexual order in any society is a deeply, deeply political order. And it establishes, if you will, what the society will come to see as the natural, normative character of politics and conflict resolution within the society. Now, where should we look to see that order? Well, certainly, I think that we need to look at the situation, status, and security of women. We need to look at the relative level of empowerment of women in the society. However, after a crucial conversation that took place almost over a dozen years ago, I have come to feel that I was looking for those indicators of empowerment in the wrong place. And that conversation that I had was over lunch. My university was hosting a group of the first female MPs in Afghanistan. And I was having lunch, being sort of the personal hostess for one of the MPs. And not knowing exactly how to break the ice, I said, I'm so hopeful when I look at you. Here you are, you're university educated, you're a practicing physician, and now you're an MP in Afghanistan. We're really seeing greater empowerment of women in that country, aren't we? And she sort of stopped me and said, Valerie, you don't understand. She said, I could go home today and my husband could divorce me simply by saying, I divorce you 3 times. And if he did, I would not have custody of my children, because in Afghanistan, custody of the children goes to the father. And she said, furthermore, I would have no place to live, for my father's family would not take me in because of the dishonor. And further, she said to me, even if I'm not divorced, I may have very little say in whom my children marry or at what age they marry. So how empowered am I really, Valerie? And I realized that you can have high female literacy and you can have the subordination of women. And Saudi Arabia is an example of that. You could have high female labor force participation, as you see in the Philippines, and yet have the subordination of women. You could have the highest female parliamentary representation in the world, which you would find in the country of Rwanda, and you could still not say that women in Rwanda were treated as equals. In other words, there's something prior to these kinds of downstream indicators. And what I became very interested in was the first political order at the household level between males and females who are living together. And so I'm interested in the kinds of questions that my acquaintance was turning me towards, such as, how much say does a woman have about getting married? How old is she when she's married? Once she is married, what kind of say does she have in her marriage? What types of property and inheritance rights do women have? Are there inequities in family law, such as what she was talking about concerning divorce and child custody? Is marriage patrilocal, where brides tend to go live with their husband's family? Are bride price or dowry paid? What about polygyny and cousin marriage? Does society view domestic violence and femicide as normal, even expected, even at times obligatory? And is rape treated more as a property crime? So not so much a crime against the woman, but a property crime against her guardian, that is either her husband or her father. It seems to me we get a lot closer to seeing the first political order in a society by asking these types of questions. So as we endeavor to get ourselves to the point where we could actually do research on this, that is, how important was women's household level disempowerment in nation state outcomes, we came up with this diagram, which we think sort of puts together the main components of what we're calling the syndrome. And what we mean by that is the syndrome of first political order of the subjugation of women, the subjugation of female interests to male interests within the society. And so the types of things that we talk about here would be levels of women's insecurity, right? The level of violence against women in the society. And then we would ask questions about whether it is males versus females that control access to the most important resources, whether women actually lack rights to hold property or other types of property rights, such as inheritance. We would then see that if males do control such assets, we usually see a patrilineal kind of social organization where valuable resources are passed from father to son to grandson. and where women marry out from the family. So they're not considered part of their natal family, and they're not considered part of the family into which they marry. From this, of course, springs a generalized preference for sons, especially in nations where there is no social security. It is sons that provide social security to the elderly because they are part of that patrilineal family line. And from that son preference, we can see a deep devaluation of the lives of daughters and wives, a real lack of investment in the lives of women. We also see springing from that fairly naturally a fairly depressed age of marriage for girls. Because girls are not considered truly family because they marry out, natal families may wish them to marry as early an age as possible. And from all of this, you begin to see a codification in customary law or tribal law or even national law of a subordinate status for women. Coming up that left-hand side, we see kind of two variants of a very subordinative order for women. In countries where women's labor is viewed as valuable, we often see the rise of what we call a bride price polygyny society, where grooms have to pay the bride's father for the right to contract marriage, and where rich men may marry numerous women in order to further increase their wealth. And then it's also possible that if women's labor is not considered valuable, that you see what we call a dowry sex ratio alteration society, which is most clearly seen in India, where the bride's family must pay the groom's family for the right to contract a marriage. And as a result, many economically rational families say, we can't afford to have daughters. And so through means such as sex-selective abortion or female infanticide, they would cull girls from the birth population. So what we found with this syndrome is it acts kind of like a straitjacket on women. And oftentimes where you have a few of these, you end up kind of with the full set of magnetic beads, right, that create this kind of straitjacket. I think where we add to the literature is to suggest that this syndrome, right, kind of a patrilineal system designed to increase the fraternity among men by subordinating female interests to male interests, is really a monster, right? It's not just a monster for women, right? It doesn't just strangle women, but it strangles men and children and whole societies, holding them in the grasp of something that is going to keep them from having good outcomes for their collectives and for their families. Governance by these extended male kin networks in these patrilineal fraternal systems, we argue, leads to unfortunate outcomes for the group: instability, violence, terror, corruption, and autocracy. And that's because it's built upon a household first political order of domestic instability, domestic violence, domestic terror, domestic corruption, domestic autocracy. So that first political order will be determinative of the larger political order within the society. Furthermore, we also argue that what we call syndrome encoding countries that deeply subjugate women will also experience other ramifications, other consequences, because many activities are gendered as female. So healthcare is gendered as female. It is the wife and mother who is in charge of the health of the family. Food security is often gendered female. It is the women who must make sure that the women and the children eat, and so forth. That we believe that there will also be negative outcomes in terms of things like health and food security. We also anticipate lower economic performance, because when you completely preclude the contribution of half of your population with their skills and talents and insights, you're really hobbling yourself in an economic sense. And of course, there are demographic consequences to the subjugation of women. And also, we believe even there will be a lack of attention to environmental security, because in almost every culture, the earth is actually gendered female, Mother Earth. And so how you treat women is how you're going to treat Mother Earth, another female as well.
This is Beth talking. I just wanted to share with you the word ronterism, which is on the screen in her PowerPoint, but which she didn't say. And I was waiting for her to say it. It's spelled like it was renterism, but it's ronterism. And it's the notion that economic value is drawn out of others or out of the land. So ronterism would be like taking rent. That's where the term comes from. You get value from other people. It's not like you've created anything. You just have a commodity and people have to pay you. And it's very endemic in very highly autocratic countries where people have, it's almost feudal, where people, the rulers can extract wealth out of the populace. So that's a fairly rough explanation, but I wanted to make sure. She'll say it coming up later. And if anyone has any questions or wants to make any comments right now, I can stop sharing and we can have a brief conversation. But we're less than halfway in. I think I'll just keep going.
In other words, if there's any takeaway that I want you to bring from this discussion today, it's what you do to your women, you do to your nation state. And so if you decide to curse your women, you will wind up cursing your nation state as well. We were able, through procuring a Minerva Initiative grant from the US Department of Defense, to collect a boatload of information that allowed us, if you will, to count how many of those syndrome components were present in any particular culture. And so you can see a map here that in essence counts how many there are. And, you know, not surprisingly, you see the extreme subjugation of women in parts of the world that are very poor, but we also see subjugation of women in countries that have strong rentier economies and are therefore not poor but rich, such as Saudi Arabia. But we also see globally other nations that are still somewhat affected by this legacy of the first political order: China, the post-Soviet Central Asian states, Latin America, and so forth. Now, to help you kind of see some of the linkages that we see between what's going on with women and what's going on with nation state outcomes, especially in terms of national security, let me give you a couple of examples. And note that there's a plethora of examples in the book that we look at. Sometimes these links that we see are pretty immediate and proximate. Remember that we talked about bride price, where a groom's family pays the bride's family for the purposes of contracting the marriage. Well, bride price is a very interesting custom because it acts, if you will, as a regressive but universal flat tax on the subpopulation of young men. Because except at the very elite levels, there's usually a going rate for a bride, under which fathers will not accept offers from grooms. Well, you can imagine that over time, there's inflationary pressure. And that each father is looking at every other father and looking to increase their bride price just a little bit, whereupon all other fathers will increase their price, and then someone else increases it, and so forth. And what you get is these irrational, exuberant, inflationary bubbles of bride price. And so bride price can increase very swiftly in a short period of time. And in fact, some have argued that it inexorably does so, not unlike real estate markets in certain time periods. And we note that surging bride price is also linked to polygyny, because in times where bride prices get high, rich men can afford to marry, but poor men cannot. And rich men are marrying polygynously. And this increase in polygyny also further obstructs the marriage market for disadvantaged young men. So who isn't going to be marrying when bride prices and polygyny rise? Well, it's going to be disadvantaged young men. And this is so because a man does not have full standing within a patrilineal culture unless he marries and produces at least one son of his own. And so a deep sense of grievance begins to develop among these disadvantaged young men under the context of increasing bride price and polygyny. And marriage for them may be significantly delayed or maybe impossible entirely. Well, what we've seen from case studies and field reports is that rebel groups offer to solve that marriage market obstruction problem for these young men. They offer to make sure that they have the requisite bride price, or in some cases, they offer to find them brides themselves. An excellent case of that latter phenomenon, of course, is Boko Haram. Something that the Western media didn't really pick up on is that Boko Haram arose in the early 2000s, in part as a reaction to an extremely dramatic rise in bride price in northern Nigeria. And that Boko Haram has always used these very high bride prices as a recruiting strategy. We all know about the girls that have been kidnapped, like the Chibok girls. But what went unreported in the Western media, at least, is that there was always a token bride price that would be left behind on the ground as the group left, so that any marriages contracted would be legitimate in their customary framework. One young lady who was subjected to this horrific practice said, "In this crisis, these men can take a wife at no extra charge. Usually it's very expensive to get married, to take a wife, very expensive to get married, but not now." Okay, so we can see that tight linkage there between inflationary bride price and increase in rebel and insurgent action. Well, this is not confined to northern Nigeria. We have excellent case studies showing the very same dynamic in places such as South Sudan, Pakistan, Timor-Leste, and other nations as well. Now, sometimes the linkages that we see between what's going on with women and what's going on at the nation state level are longer term and more structural. And an example of this could be the type of research that Professor Rush was alluding to earlier, which is our research on the alteration of sex ratios worldwide. One of what I consider to be sort of the underreported mega trends of our world is the increasing masculinization of the world's population. In a normal population, the ratio of males to females is approximately 98 males per 100 females. Fewer males because males tend to live shorter lives than women. Women tend to outlive men. However, the global sex ratio is now documented for sure at being over 101.8 males per 100 females on the planet. And this incredible distortion, right? You may think to yourself, hey, 98, 101, what's the big deal? But we're talking about, tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of people here. It is not due to any natural disaster or any sort of calamity or any sort of plague. This is entirely man-made, all right? This alteration in sex ratios. When I first started studying the issue of sex ratios in 1990, we could only find 5 nations that had abnormal birth sex ratios. And 2 of them were Hong Kong and Macau, one of which disappeared in the... Now, however, there are actually not 18, but 19. Sorry, I miscounted. So we've got Afghanistan, Albania, Armenia, Azerbaijan, China, Georgia, Hong Kong, India, Kosovo, Montenegro, Nepal, North Macedonia, Pakistan, Papua New Guinea, the Philippines, Samoa, Serbia, Taiwan, and Vietnam. So you can see that this is not confined to East Asia. It's not confined to South Asia. We have Southeast Asia. We've got the Himalaya regions. We've got Europe in the Balkans. We've got Central Asian republics. We have Pacific Island nations. This is really an important trend. Furthermore, in addition to these alterations in birth sex ratios, the great migrations of the last decade have also created some interesting sex ratio alterations. So to give an example, in 2015, as you know, we had that huge wave of migration to Europe. And one of the only nations to sort of open its borders and say, please come, was Sweden. Well, the first wave of any massive migration is almost always young adult men, right? And that certainly characterized the great migrations of 2015, where 85% of the migrants were young adult men. And they supposedly paved the way for others to follow, right? Others who were not young adult men. But Sweden also added something very interesting. They also said, if you're under 18, we will never deport you for any reason. But they also had no medical checks to determine whether someone was really under 18 or not. So you can imagine that all the young adult men arriving in Sweden during this time period claimed to be 16 and 17, right? That's a completely rational thing to do. Well, what happened was that when Sweden went and counted its population the following year, they discovered that the sex ratio among 16 and 17-year-olds was 123 males per 100 females, which was actually far worse than China, which had only 117 males per 100 females. So this interesting sex ratio phenomenon even got exported through migration as well, and not just through alteration of birth sex ratios.
Well, I think the sex ratio thing is so interesting. And of course, she didn't say this, but it adds to crime. Anytime, I mean, as we saw those huge groups marching through Europe up to Germany and Sweden, a person couldn't think anything about, this is going to be horrible. You know, this age of men all by themselves without mothers and sisters and wives, you know, they don't behave well. So it's been a problem. Crime has been a problem with that group.
Does anyone else have any comments about what they've seen or heard so far?
I'd like to say, I also immediately thought that generation of young men will have been raised in a culture where exploitation and submission of women at home is normal. And those supposed 16, 17-year-old men, regardless of what their age actually is, as they become permanent members of Sweden. And I was living in Norway at the time, and there were lots of young male immigrants to Norway as well, and Denmark, and as well as Germany. That generation is coming to what was a traditional Norwegian culture or Swedish culture or German culture with a whole new set of expectations for marriage, and that's going to trickle forward. That's going to not trickle, it's going to flow forward and change domestic violence, and the 20% of any population is going to have a huge impact. It's there's hope for their children or maybe grandchildren, but that whole adage of the sins of the father sins of the fathers are visited on the fourth and fifth generations will appear in those cultures as well, which I find even more frightening. It's not just a problem right now, but it's one for the next 2 or 3 generations.
And she actually addresses that later when she talks about how the US needs to be responding to the facts or the syndrome as she's laid it out. And she will talk about the data set and all of the analysis that went into these theories in the next part of what we're going to listen to. But
I Another thing I noticed, and other people come into, but that United States was green, meant it was on the good side of the patriarchy versus unfair laws, or that it didn't have much effect on our overall governance because we didn't have the problem of the patriarchal underlaying thing. And I thought that was not quite right. You know, where she had, that was the picture where she had all of Africa red and a lot of the Middle Eastern yellow, and then United States and Canada, for example, were all green. Did anyone else think that?
Yeah.
Jill,
I agree. Yeah, I noted that too. I don't think the syndrome is absent in the United States.
Well, actually, in the book, they do an analysis of rating countries between 0 and 16, and we are rated 1. So we are not the very best. And there are elements that they can describe on how they do that rating.
Jerry, you had your hand up. I feel like Beth can't see you, but we should hear
Sure.
what you were thinking.
Yeah, I'm wondering if the rating from 0 to 16 has to do with legally mandated patriarchy versus attitudes of the people. For example, Japan was also green, but yet we know clearly that neither of those countries, the attitudes and actual behavior, there is a lot of sexism going on. So I don't know if the rating reflects the attitudes, behavior of people as opposed. I think my guess is it reflects the formal legal structure. Anyway.
And I noticed that Japan was green, but light green, not dark green. So it definitely indicates Japan is not as fair.
Yes, there's a rather large corpus of research literature now that shows that when you masculinize sex ratios, you get higher crime rates, higher political protest rates. You also—
Now, can you hear that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I apologize for not knowing what I did.
also exacerbate what we've already talked about in terms of marriage market obstruction. So for example, bride prices go through the roof. And one of the fascinating things has been to see the change in China. You know, despite the fact that China is a communist country, they still have bride price. And bride prices have gone up 10 times due to the increasing scarcity of women in that, that country. And of course, all of this, right, enables rebel and insurgent groups to begin to recruit on that basis. Empirical research has also shown that crimes against women, especially trafficking and forced prostitution, but also rape and other types of violent crimes, increase as well. And we also see increased mobility restriction on women in societies with masculinized sex ratios. We also see much greater HIV and other STD spread, probably because of the increase in trafficking and forced prostitution. And you may even see an altered calculus of deterrence due to an altered perception of the cost of attrition warfare. Most societies in the West absolutely eschew attrition warfare. They simply cannot take the political and manpower costs of a war of attrition. But a country that has a large surplus of young adult men about whom they worry in terms of instability may have a very different view of attrition warfare, and that maybe attrition warfare is worth it and not as costly to them as it would be to other countries. So, is there any hard evidence? I say this because when I first started to do this sort of a line of research, looking at the relationship between what's going on with women and what's going on with nation state outcomes, it was very common to hear, that's such an interesting story. Why don't you come back when you have some hard evidence about these linkages? And so my colleagues and I were very keen on making sure that we had rigorous statistical evidence that would accompany this theoretical framework. And so, as mentioned, it was actually the US Department of Defense which funded this research. we were able to operationalize that full syndrome that we talked about previously. And let me tell you, that was quite a chore. There was no existing data set, for example, on the prevalence of patrilocal marriage, and just try to find a data set about dowry or bride price. You know, they just don't exist. So it took a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of man and woman power to operationalize women's household level disempowerment. And then we undertook multivariate regression. Obviously, we didn't have a time series with 7 control variables. So we're controlling for alternate and complementary explanations. And so we looked at sort of 9 dimensions of nation state outcomes. So we were looking at political stability and governance indicators, security and conflict indicators, economic performance, rentierism, health and well-being, demographic indicators, education indicators, social progress indicators, and environmental protection indicators. And we you know, one of the things that we did in order to make sure that people, again, did not treat this research lightly is we chose as a bar for significance a very stringent standard, which is rho less than or equal to 0.001. So I don't know if you're familiar with statistics, but it's typical to use 0.05 or 0.01. This is 0.001. In addition, we were also going to make sure that no one could accuse us of cherry picking the outcome variables. So we actually looked at 161 outcome variables. I'm certainly not going to read these, but you can imagine that we had multiple indicators for each of those 9 dimensions because we wanted to make sure that no one could say, oh, you chose this index, but you know, what if you had chosen this index? Would you still get the same results? Well, we wanted to make sure that was not an issue. So what were the findings? Well, I'm pleased to tell you that they were even more, I think, profound than I thought they were going to be. So, for example, 22 measures of political instability, 93.8% of our model runs showed the syndrome as being highly significant with either the largest or second largest effect size in the entire multivariate model. 35 measures of conflict and insecurity, 75%. 10 measures of terror, 80%. The incidence of terror is strongly associated with the subjugation of women, just as our theory was projecting. Economic performance, 62.5%. Public health and well-being, over 70%. Environmental preservation, 85%. There really is something to the notion that you treat Mother Earth like you treat other women in your society. Demographic security, over 70%. Educational attainment, 60%. Social progress, 75%. So overall, over all of those 122 model runs incorporating 161 variables, 71.3% of the model runs found the subjugation of women at the household level to be highly significant and either the most determinative factor in the equation or the second most determinative factor. If you're into odds, we also ran some logistic regressions. So a logistic regression allows you to say, how many times the risk do you have of having a bad outcome if you get one step worse on your subjugation of women? So for every step you get worse on the subjugation of women, you have twice the chance of being a fragile state. 3.5 times the chance of having a government that's more autocratic, less effective, and more corrupt. 1.5 times the chance of being unstable and violent. 1.28 times the chance of experiencing terrorism. 1.4 times the chance of your country being poor and in economic decline. 1.5 times the chance of having a low GDP per capita. The same for low environmental quality. Almost twice the chance of having a high fertility rate. Almost twice the chance of having a higher incidence of preventable deaths, and almost twice the chance of scoring badly on the Global Hunger Index. So this is pretty important stuff. Professor Rose McDermott at Brown University, I think really nailed it. She said, The findings are clear, consistent, and statistically robust across the board. In fact, the results are the kind of thing most social scientists strive for, but almost never find in the course of their careers. If these findings were about something not related to women, chances are they would be treated as revolutionary in international relations theory. Indeed, the effects are much stronger than those supporting the notion of the democratic peace that has spawned an entire cottage industry of inquiry. And she says, I leave it to the reader to ponder why powerful effects regarding the treatment of women on the health and security of states do not receive such extensive attention. Good question. Why do we get these results? Well, again, I'm giving you only an abridged version of the book, but let me just point out that we think that there's at least 3 causal pathways here. So the first causal pathway we see is boot camp, right? That is the socialization of every new member of the society. We believe there's no better training camp for political violence and instability than lived domestic terror perpetration, lived domestic corruption and exploitation, lived domestic autocracy. When you're experiencing that within the household, you see that it is functional at getting people what they want. And it becomes seen as normal, normative, unremarkable, the way things are done. All right, this is the kind of political order that will seem the most natural to your people. Secondly, as we've seen with sex ratio alteration and bride price and polygyny, the syndrome is also creating structural goads. It's as if you had a stool and you purposefully sawed off one of the legs. All right, that stool is going to be unstable no matter what you do. All right, you can prop it up in a number of different ways. You can try to get around the fact that you've sawed off one of the legs of the stool, but it will always be an unstable stool. You have built it in structurally. And then lastly, the last causal pathway is that you are specifically disempowering women. That is the very people who could say things like, I don't think this political violence is going to be very useful for our society, or I think we should be paying more attention to health and welfare of our citizens, and so forth. So you are muting, you are silencing the voices of those who would have a very alternative view of the functionality of this approach. Now, I'm oftentimes asked to give these research findings back in DC, usually to the military or to the intelligence community or to the State Department. And I often preface my conclusion by saying, do you consider yourself a national security realist? And 100% of the time, everyone's like, yep, I'm a realist. Because I mean, what does it say that you're a nationalist security idealist, right? It means you're just a woolly-headed thinker. So everyone believes they're a realist. So I say, okay, well, in light of these empirical findings, are you a realist if you believe that what's going on with women is going to affect the security and stability and governance and so forth of the nation state? And they're like, yeah, I think that's actually the way the world works. And so I say a further question. I say, look, are you a realist if you believe that the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, as outlined in instruments like UN Security Council Resolution 1325 or the US National Action Plan for Women, Peace, and Security, is really in the national interest? And they're like, yeah, maybe so. But then I ask them the question, which is the question at which they all sort of pause. And I say, can you call yourself a realist if you don't believe these things? And that kind of sets them back a little, because I can tell you that even to this date, in the security studies academic community, as well as in the world of national security policymaking, what's going on with women is seen as something that is orthogonal or perhaps at best tangential to what's going on with national security. It is not seen as a core national security interest. But our research, we're hoping, will change those attitudes. Well, at that point, my audience is usually saying, okay, all right, I'm with you. All right, I believe it does matter. But what would really change, right? Would anything really change about, say, US foreign policy if we considered the situation of women? So I say, well, let's consider that question. I say, hey, if the US is not tracking what's going on with women, how can it expect to have an effective foreign policy? For example, right, our political risk analysis, our conflict early warning models, right? None of them contain any gender variables whatsoever. But in terms of situational awareness, how are you going to anticipate instability in other countries if, for example, you're not tracking things like trajectory of bride price, right? Or sex ratio alterations or things of this nature? I don't think you can. I don't think you have full situational awareness. How will the US decide which subnational actors are most likely to bring stability in the long term if one doesn't examine how each group treats women before making a commitment? I mean, obviously, the ultimate example in this regard is the Mujahideen that we supported after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979. We just decided that, whoever was opposing the Mujahideen were friends of ours, right? My enemy's enemy is my friend. But if we really wanted stability in Afghanistan, we also would have asked ourselves, well, how does the Mujahideen treat women? And how does it intend to treat women when they get into power? And I think we all found out exactly what the answer to that question was as the Mujahideen morphed into the Taliban and was extraordinarily, even horrifically oppressive to women, and drove their country even into greater levels of poverty and instability, and certainly terrorism, right? But there was no one at the National Security Council table back in those days who was saying, we're not sure that these Mujahideen are a good bet. Let's take a look at how they intend to treat women. No one was even asking the question. How will the US avoid the trap of peace negotiations where the rights of women are bargained away to make quote unquote peace between warlords if it doesn't understand the linkage between sustainable peace and the empowerment of women? You simply can't have a stable country or a sustainable peace if you throw women under the bus. And I think what's very sad, of course, right now is that is pretty much what we're doing to the women of Afghanistan. How will the US track which of its own citizens are the greatest domestic terror threat if domestic violence is not viewed as a form of domestic terror? Okay, there is a very, very tight association between each of our mass murderers and terrorists in the United States, mass shooters over the last 20 years, and whether those individuals had any allegations, arrests, or convictions for domestic violence against a mother, a sister, a wife, an ex-wife, a girlfriend, or an ex-girlfriend. Very tight. Until we start seeing that domestic violence is the boot camp for domestic terrorism, I don't think we're going to have a good handle on which of our citizens we should be keeping track of. Immigration strategy, right? We certainly, with the last administration, there was, some sort of reasoning about if you're from a particular country, you're a problem. Well, that's not it, right? That's not it. All right. The issue is, whether individuals who come to this country are going to be undermining women's rights. And that is a question that nations have become much more attuned towards. So, for example, Australia now has questions on the citizenship test that asks you whether it is legal to beat your spouse, whether it is legal to have your daughter's genitals cut, whether it is legal to arrange a marriage for a child, because they see that it is the importation of practices like this that are the issue. and that those who are willing to come to Australia and give up such practices are very welcome, but that those who are intent on keeping those practices are probably going to undermine the security of Australia in the long run. Norway does something similar. Canada does something similar as well. How will the US know that ending child marriage worldwide would probably do more for world peace than almost any other investment? Okay, oftentimes I see schemes for how are we going to bring stability to the world, and none of them mention the key factor that mires countries in intergenerational poverty, ignorance, and misery. And that's the child marriage of girls, right? Making a 13-year-old a mother, making a 14-year-old a mother. This is a prime example. If you curse your women, you curse your nation state. No country with prevalent child marriage has ever progressed significantly in economic terms, in technological terms, in governance terms, and so forth. But yet child marriage has not been a priority for example, our foreign aid initiatives. How would the US know when exporting democracy makes sense and when it doesn't? Well, I think here an analysis of what's going on with women could be very, very helpful. Right? If you're coding virtually all of those subordinative practices concerning women, then to export democracy is probably going to actually pour gasoline on the fire of tribal, clan, and ethnic conflict. However, we know that there are countries that are transitioning away from such severe subordination of women. And it is those countries where greater pluralism, democratization may have the greatest salutary effects. So in sum, I guess I believe that one day the idea that foreign policy or national security policy could ignore the situation of women will be seen as laughably naive. I honestly believe that one day they will look back on our textbooks, they will look back at the table of contents at our top security journals, and they will scratch their heads or even laugh that it was considered to be, in essence, kind of a womanless world. And I think that, that it will be seen as absolutely imperative that the first political order be examined when looking at security affairs. So I think we're on the cusp of a rethinking of what national security is and how we get it. I think given everything that we've just looked at in this presentation, it's fair to say that women's insecurity profoundly and significantly undermines state security. I think actually it was Hillary Clinton who, when she was Secretary of State, said it best in 2012 when she said, "The subjugation of women is a threat to the common security of our world and to the national security of our country." I furthermore think that disrupting the weak points of that syndrome may be foundational to undercutting the roots of instability, conflict, and ineffective governance worldwide. And I think only by adopting those women, peace, and security lenses can we see these linkages and make our policies more effective. So that's the end of my presentation. For those of you who are interested in data and information about women's situation worldwide, I would refer you to our free online database at womenstats.org.
Okay, and you could hear that rest of that presentation. Before we get started, Jerry raised a question during the break about why was Japan in a yellow color on
light green, actually.
light green. In the scale of 0 to 16, I just looked up Japan in the book, it's number 5. So those colors had a range, and I don't have it in front of me right this minute, but it was probably at the high end of green. So, and I'd be glad to read any other countries you're interested in. I can say the countries that are 0 are the Scandinavian countries and Australia. Interestingly. So I'll open it up for your comments and thoughts and questions.
Yeah, is bride price synonymous with dowry, or is there a slight difference?
There's a difference. Bride price is what the father of the the groom pays to marry the bride. Bride price goes to the bride's father. And dowry is what the father pays to have someone take their daughter from them. So it's a different direction of exchange, but in both cases,
Okay.
it's none of that money goes to the girl or the woman or the wife. They don't see any of it. And in fact, if a woman leaves, in some cultures, if a woman leaves her husband, the husband's family has a right to demand the bride price back, which, most families don't even have at that point. That's been spent. And so the woman is unable to leave because her family can't buy her back, so to speak.
I'll call on the people because you can't see them. Celine was having her hand up.
Thank you, Jill.
Yes, I'm just wondering what this means for our United States foreign policy and national security. In dealing with other countries, she said that going and touting democracy is the sure way to get us, not listened to. So what do we do to get some of these countries' views changed? How can we show that, supporting women and giving women rights actually is better for their economy and for their lives? So what can we do? That's what I'm trying to say. What would our foreign policy experts need to do to convince another country to accept this data as real?
That's sort of like the $64,000 question, I think. When the little group, the 5 people group that I was in read this book, we were sitting there, and all of us are experienced results members who talk to our members of Congress all the time, and their aides. And so we said, well, what can we do? How can we change the situation? How can we, now that we understand this, what should we be doing? And so we decided that the thing that we could do is raise awareness. And so, for instance, I provided a copy of the book to Derek Kilmer, and one to his district director, Andrea Roper, and one to his foreign affairs aide, Bo Purd. And I have yet to hear back from them about their thoughts about the book, so I'm going to be pursuing that. But it wouldn't hurt for others of you to be, emailing his office or asking him in town halls or sending him phone calls, whatever, to start to raise this up with our member of Congress, because he listens to us. That's one thing. We were able to actually meet with Valerie Hudson, the woman who spoke, the chief author. We found her email and sent her a request, would she be willing to meet with our little group? And she said yes. So she spent an hour talking to us. And one of our questions was, how is this being taken up in the State Department? What's happening? And she said, well, actually, she's been invited to speak a lot, but more by the Department of Defense than by the State Department, which was interesting. But the Department of Defense is the group that funded her research. So they have a little more ownership and sense of ownership in the women's stats and this book and the information, the construct. It's almost like they're trying to describe reality and nobody's really described it. And for the women in the group that I was in, when we read the book, we're going, oh my God, we knew this all along, but we never had a way to put it all together into a clear understanding and picture. So, if you've lived the reality, it's almost hard to see it. It's like water. But once you can read it on the page and see the data, it makes a lot more sense. But how to take it into our, how can I say this? How to take this into our foreign policy. Actually, the US Congress passed an act that said that every department that has to do with foreign policy, and there were about 8 of them, I think, have to address a women, peace, and security agenda and have to do every 5-year review and report to Congress. That's not a real strong way to make a change, but at least the UN passed a women, peace, and security agenda and have a working group that's working on that now. So it's not dead. This stuff is out and percolating, and you can connect with you can go online and find the 5-year report that just came out this last summer that went to Congress, or you can go to the UN and find this information. And I actually have created a digital document that has the links to some of those that I'm happy to share with you all. Sure.
It's so true. My brother-in-law, who was in Middle Eastern Studies, he'd gotten his PhD from Berkeley, which was a very good place to get it. And he worked for both the CIA, the State Department, and then he went to the college that's called the War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And he said, by far, the most realistic and best students that he had were the generals. He said, because he would talk to them before each of those Iraq wars, and the generals never wanted to go in. They did not, but they do what they're told. But the State Department particularly was always playing the angles. You know, it's very political. And instead of thinking like the soldiers do, what the hell am I going to confront once I go in? And then there's another book that came out with Afghanistan right now, that how many mistakes that the Army made handing off so I think this is why they might be very, very interested, because if you read all the stuff that's going on now, as they're describing the war for the last 5 or 10 years, they kept handing off the power to the worst possible warlord, who was just horrible, and they kept doing it. And it was done not even at the general level, but more local. And it was by soldiers who really had not been trained. Don't deal with people who are crappy to women. That's sort of like your message now. Don't deal with the most crappy people who treat people badly. And so they had not learned that at that time.
Well, I have a few things I'd like to share with you both about Valerie Hudson and about the book, because these are really interesting facts about her. She was raised Catholic, but at the age of 14, she converted to Mormonism, and she is a Mormon. And she started this work at Brigham Young University when she was a professor there. And I think that's where it occurred, that story when she was meeting with the Afghani woman member of parliament. I think that was at Brigham Young. Her 2 colleagues who co-authored the book with her are still at Brigham Young, but Valerie now was invited to sit in the Texas AMU University George H.W. Bush seat of foreign affairs. Very prestigious seat that she has there. She has 8 children, 2 of which are severely disabled. And this is almost like a situation where Nixon goes to China, where from the belly of the beast of Latter-day Saints comes this prophetic information and serious work about the importance of equal value to women. And I think it makes it even more credible than it would be if she were, a flaming liberal. She's not. She is a very serious, and I think it's a credit to her academic discipline and dedication that despite maybe what she believes in terms of her, the great pumpkin, as we heard earlier today, she has committed to academic rigor and to the importance of women. So I just wanted to share that with you. And the last thing I'd like to say is, please consider getting a copy of the book, sharing this book, and I will send you the link to this video, which is quite a bit longer than what I shared with you, but more question and answer and introductions. And share this information with other people. I think this is this is right up there with racism as some of the most and global warming as some of the most critical information that we could have to deal with if we want to create a better world. So for me, this is very powerful. And with that, I'll close.
Thank you very much, Beth, for doing this. I think it opens our eyes for a variety of things, and we can see where it intersects in our life and in perhaps our actions and actions of others. We can see things in a different way. So I thank you again very, very much. And since there's no more questions, we'll close the session.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank everyone for attending. And I'd like to thank the Adult Education Committee for making this possible to share this information. Thanks.
Our
Jill.
pleasure. Our pleasure. Thank you very much.
Mhm.
Bye-bye all, and thanks for attending.